As a researcher, I get to look into the mechanisms, so basically how physical and biological processes interact and how this interaction is affected by the way we manage our ecosystems. On a more personal level, I'm fascinated by how plants can cope with very variable climatic conditions. My name is Giulia Vico and I'm professor in plant ecology. I study how environmental conditions affect plants and plant communities. In particular, I look at how detrimental conditions like insufficient precipitation or heat waves affect plants and whether the risk of damage is increasing with climate change. In parallel, I also look at whether we can use ecological processes, that is, work with nature, to reduce the vulnerability of our managed ecosystem to climate change. To these aims, I develop process-based models and analyze large data sets from different sources. This type of research is needed because we need to adapt to changing climatic conditions. Also, we need to reduce the environmental effects of the way in which we produce our food and fiber, and do so while maintaining sufficient and reliable productivity, which is quite a challenge altogether.
Welcome, Giulia.
Thank you.
You are an engineer by training. How does your technical background support and influence your research?
So, on the one hand, I think it pushes me in thinking at the system level, which I think it's very useful with complex questions. On a more practical level, it gave me a training in abstraction, which is also helpful, and also quite a bit of strong quantitative skills, which I use on a daily basis, I would say.
And you mentioned in the video that you're fascinated by how plants cope with variable climate conditions. And what set you on that path?
I think it was out of curiosity mostly. Plants are rooted somewhere. They literally have to cope with whatever is falling on them from the sky. And if you think about that, the conditions are very variable. I mean, any tree outside here would have seen -10 over the winter, and we'll see maybe +30 over the summer. So the question was, how can they do that simply? And then as I started working and looking in that, it was clear that these responses are complex. There are a number of threshold-like responses. And so it became clear that, we shouldn't be probably looking at average conditions, but how they respond to variability in conditions in particular extremes.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting indeed. And which aspects of climate change do you think we need to understand in order to adapt our farming and forestry to changing conditions and variable conditions?
Even before adaptation, I think a key point is understanding the effects of combination of conditions, not single factor alone. We might have a slight reduction of precipitation or warmer temperatures, and those could be totally fine for the plants. But it might be the combination of those that is particularly damaging. And also, some of the aspects or conditions that are expected to change may have opposite effects. So what we are very much interested in, and I think we really need to understand, even before thinking about how we adapt, is the net effect of those conditions.
Do you think we talk too much about average measures and single factors?
I mean, I think it's totally natural in the fact that we need to start somewhere. So that's an obvious starting point. But with more extreme conditions becoming common, then it's probably not enough. But of course, we need to start somewhere. So it's totally natural, I would say.
Please tell us more. Please
Sure.
get prepared for your lecture. Then I would like to introduce Giulia Vico, Professor of Plant Ecology, talking about agriculture and forests facing climate change, impact or adaptation.
Thank you. So, how do plants respond to variable climatic conditions? As I hinted at, plants face a wide variety of conditions. Some of those are extreme. There could be like seasonal patterns or like year-to-year variability, day-to-day variability. For the most part, plants are totally fine, actually. They do thrive even, as was the case in summer 2023 around here. But occasionally, the conditions actually exceed those that plants can cope with. Here in Sweden, summer 2018 will come to the mind of many with the stunted crops and a yield reduction of around 40%, the lowest yield since the 1950s. It was not just crops that suffered, it was also forests. The most obvious and apparent effect were a bunch of wildfires. But the effect of that summer became clearer over the subsequent years with the large die-offs and as a result of the stress suffered during that summer and the increased vulnerability to pests that came after that. But what was the difference between summer 2018 and summer 2023, just as an example? Here you see the conditions during the growing season here in Uppsala over the past 50 years. So summer 2018 was particularly warm. Precipitation was low, but was not incredibly low. But importantly, that came in few large events with up to a whopping 38 days of dry period in between. And it was probably the combination of these conditions that created the most damage. So how plants respond to climatic conditions is a key question in my group. But conditions are changing, and conditions like those of the summer of 2018 in Northern Europe are expected to become the new norm already in the second half of this century. So we need to adapt. How do we do so? And importantly for us, can we exploit ecological mechanisms to adapt primary production systems to change climatic conditions? What I mean is, does it make a difference to consider a certain plant or another? Would the specific characteristics of a plant affect its vulnerability to these new conditions? Or would considering a mixture of species make really a difference because these plants, for example, tap into resources at different times of the growing season or in different spatial niches? We answer these questions via two complementary approaches. On the one hand, we develop and use process-based models, that is, descriptions of energy, carbon, water, and nutrient fluxes from the soil through the plant to the atmosphere, and how those are affected by soil features, plant characteristics, growing conditions like climatic conditions, and interactions with other plants. We used such an approach to assess whether perennial grains could be more suitable in the face of extended dry spell. Charles mentioned briefly the idea. If you think about that, our field crops are basically annual plants, so plants that are sown and harvested within a few months. Now, perennial grains has been suggested as an alternative, more sustainable alternative to annual plants. But one potential drawback is that they still allocate only a smaller part of their resources to seeds, which might be problematic if that's the part we are interested in. But importantly, they have a better developed rooting system, which means tapping into a larger volume of soil. At the same time, they are also, or tend to be also, larger plants. So they need more resources. So what happens in the face of a long dry period? So what we saw with our models is that perennial wheat tend to maintain better water status during a dry period, and hence have a higher potential for growth. Good. At the same time, because of the better water status, but because also the bigger plants, they consume more water. And this might be problematic if that water is coming or needs to come, for example, from irrigation. We could also see with our mechanistic model exactly how the plant characteristics would shift this trade-off. And looking into those mechanisms is exactly a benefit of this kind of models. In parallel, and in particular when models, when we don't have enough understanding of the processes to actually develop a model, we collate and analyze large data sets. We get our data from different sources. An important one is long-term experiments, like those maintained by SLU. These are actually treasure trove of information because plants have been subjected to similar management but very variable conditions over several decades in those experiments, which gives us quite a bit of material to work with. As an example, we explored whether diversifying crop rotations could work as an adaptation to warming. What we did was to collate yield data from a number of long-term experiments in temperate agriculture. And then we wanted to see how the cereal yield on the y-axis changed with what we call the rotational functional richness. What I mean here is going from a cereal monoculture, so just cereals grown year after year, to a more diverse rotation, including not just cereals, but also broadleaves, legumes, or leis, or some combination of those. What we found is that when conditions are warmer, yields of the cereal are decreased. But it is enough to add one functional group to more than balance this decrease in yield due to warming. This would mean going from a cereal monoculture, functional richness 1, to, for example, a cereal in rotation with an oil crop or a ley. So I've shown a couple of examples of approaches for climate change adaptation, but we work with several others. On the one hand, we look at adaptation strategies that are aimed at changing the growing conditions faced by the plant. Think about irrigation, drainage, or a shift in the growing season, so shift in the sowing and then harvesting time. But we are maybe even more interested in adaptation strategies that have a more ecological backdrop, that explicitly exploit ecological mechanisms such as reduced competition, increased facilitation, or ecosystem services. Among those, think about looking at specific species or varieties, so species or varieties with specific characteristics that make them less vulnerable to detrimental conditions. But also diversification. I presented an example of diversification in time, the crop rotational diversity, but we also look at diversification in space. And in the case of forest, this means not just species mixtures, but also age mixtures, potentially, and diversification in the landscape. Now, for all of this presentation, I talked about plants and how they are affected by climatic conditions and how they can we can work with the plants to reduce the vulnerability to the detrimental conditions. Now, plants are an integral part of ecosystems, and so they affect and are affected by all the ecosystem processes, which means soil processes, herbivory, you name those. But I would argue that also societies play a role here. We depend on plants for our food, feed, and fiber. We appropriate that primary production mostly from managed ecosystems. Now, the functioning of managed ecosystems is by definition affected by management choices. In turn, those management choices are depend on how we cope with variability ourselves, our previous experiences, and of course, the whole socioeconomic context we are embedded in. Then we also now know that in the long run and on large scales, our decisions affect the climatic conditions through greenhouse gas emissions. So what was looked like maybe a story of adaptation of or using plant ecology to adapt to climatic conditions and their variability is actually a more complex story with climate change mitigation, but also a number of socioeconomic questions in the background. So we work with these questions in collaboration with a number of colleagues through interdisciplinary works. In closing, I would like to thank the current and past member of my group, as well as a number of colleagues here at SLU and beyond that have supported quite a number of interesting and rewarding collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. So interesting to listen to you. And you are welcome with your questions. And for those of you participating online, you can send your questions to nyaprofessorer@slu.se. nyaprofessorer@slu.se. Julia, with your background in modeling and data analysis, how do you see your work complementing the research of colleagues who study plants through experiments and hands-on observation, especially when it comes to how plants respond to changing climates?
I think it's a two-way interaction and beneficial for both parts. On the one hand, models, process-based models would be impossible if we didn't have a good understanding of the processes themselves and information to actually build models. So in that respect, we're pretty much dependent on empirical work of all sorts of all aspects. On the other hand, models allow us to explore a wide variety of scenarios and even maybe play around with plants that don't exist, ideotypes. So in that respect, we can look also go beyond experiments through models, and potentially generate hypotheses that can be then tested out in the field. So maybe shrink the number of hypotheses to be tested.
Okay. So do you more or less always work together with the researchers doing experiments?
It can be direct in the sense that in project where we are the group doing the modeling work or the data analysis, large data analysis, and there is another group collecting the data. Or it can be a little bit loose in the sense, we are, a director was saying, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So there is a literature behind that we take good use of.
But I'm just curious, when you create a model, how can you evaluate the uncertainty or the certainty of the model? How do you work with that part? Just don't go too deep into it, but more general, how do you cope with that?
So we definitely try to see how much our modeling choices affect the final result, and that is giving us a sense of how important the choice is, how carefully we should be. And then, of course, we look at the model results and try to compare those with independent observations if we can, or at least patterns. And most often than not, then basically you go back and revise your model till there is a good agreement. And you're confident that your results make sense.
So it's like an iterative way of working. So, okay, do we have any questions? Yes, we have one over here.
Thank you for your presentation, Giulia. And I have a question about new technology, artificial intelligence and others. And you talked about how different management options could mitigate the impact of effect of climate on crops. And do you see any new management possibilities coming up now with the new technology?
That's a good question. I think if you're thinking about artificial intelligence, I think the area where that would be most impactful could be actually to be able to review a lot of information in a very effective way before actually thinking about the technology out in the field. But I would also imagine that the ability, for example, to process and observe images from the field, not just also in other wavelengths, so for example NDVI and so forth, to see ahead of time whether there are problems or how big of a problem we have before it's visible, like the crop is wilted or the plant is dead. So those could be some areas that I would see where increasingly those technology could help. And of course, also, those are also data that we can use to test hypotheses. Might be more easier to collect or faster to collect.
I think we have another question over there.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. On your last slide, you indicated that the sort of future research was going to be more interdisciplinary. Could you elaborate a little bit on what the research questions would be there?
Well, I would say it's not just the future, it's also the present. We're working with, for example, colleagues at the Department of Economics to try to understand farmers' decisions and whether in the face of extreme climatic conditions. And at the same time, we might have an idea of how plants respond to those conditions, but what happened at the farm level. And under that respect, I mean, it's fortunate, I would say, that there has been a 2018 here in Sweden, because it gives us a very clear event to look and to look on the effects after that. In other areas, we are working with the social scientists to look at really how we do science. What are the implicit assumptions that we make, and how those affect our the questions we ask, and hence also the answers we get. So these are just a couple of areas that I would mention here.
Thank you, Giulia. Can you clarify a bit more about the limitations and the benefits of having this model approach that you have, especially to this system perspective that you want to have?
Well, some points, I think the most beneficial part is really like looking at scenarios, and which is critical in the face of climate change. We are not just talking with conditions that are occurring now, but what could happen in the future. So that's I think that's extremely important. And then, as I was hinting, and to play around with systems that maybe don't exist, even plants that don't exist. I'm not saying that this is the solutions to all our questions, and actually that's precisely the reason why we also combine that with the large data analysis. Sometimes we simply don't know enough about the system, and that's definitely the case when you start looking. We might have a relatively good understanding of what happens in a plant, but if we were to model what happens in the entire ecosystem, then we would start having either processes that we are a little bit unsure about, or we would miss enough information to properly develop and parameterize models. And that's why we kind of work with both.
Well, I think this will be the last question. Which one should I choose? I think I come from the forestry perspective, so it will be this one. I know you also work in forests or with forests. So from your research perspective, how do farming and forestry align?
Well, I think one important element to consider is that by and large, a tree in a forest and a crop in a field are facing similar challenges. It is true that a tree has a higher longevity, but some of the ecophysiological processes are actually very, very similar. So I think it's important to consider that. And on a more practical level, I think it has been beneficial for me to work in both systems, because there are different disciplinary traditions, I would say, and so the way in which problems are tackled, the toolbox is different, and so being familiar with both has helped me in basically borrow and take a method from one and use it in the other, and the other way around.
Oh, well, that's very beneficial. So with that, we will thank you, Giulia.
Thank you.